In a quiet mansion in New York, two twins refused to eat, frozen by the pain of losing their mother. Their father, a powerful billionaire, had already given up hope, until a new nanny, a young woman of humble origins, arrived and, with a gesture as simple as baking cookies, began to melt the ice and change everyone's destiny forever. But before we find out how the smell of chocolate chip cookies can heal a heart, we want to hear from you. From which city in the world are you following us, and what time is it now? Tell us in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and let's get started. Autumn in upstate New York painted the landscape with a melancholy beauty, a burst of warm color before the cold weather arrived. To Lucy Evans, staring out the window of a taxi that was taking her deeper and deeper into a zone of quiet wealth, the beauty seemed distant, almost artificial. The car finally slowed, turning into a driveway marked not by a name but by two massive stone pillars and a black iron gate that swung inward with a silent, intimidating majesty. The long gravel driveway wound through a lawn that looked more like a perfectly manicured golf course, lined with centuries-old oaks that stretched out their branches like sentinels. The mansion, when it finally came into view, was not welcoming. It was an imposing structure of gray stone and dark glass, a modern fortress designed to shield itself from the world. Lucy felt a sinking feeling in her stomach, a mixture of awe and dread. With her small battered canvas suitcase in the back seat, she felt like an intruder about to invade a sanctuary of grief. The front door, a massive piece of wood that seemed to weigh a ton, swung open before the driver could even park completely. A man in uniform, his face impassive, was waiting on the threshold. The silence that emanated from the interior of the house was almost a physical force, a wave that hit her the moment she stepped out of the car. As she stepped into the foyer, the sound of her own shoes on the marble floor felt like a desecration. The space was cavernous, with a ceiling that disappeared into the darkness and a grand staircase that rose like the spine of a sleeping leviathan. There were no flowers, no music, no smells of home, only the faint scent of cleaning products and old wood. The air was cold and thin, like that of a museum after closing time. Lucy knew immediately that the house was not just quiet, it was mute, as if a terrible scream had taken place there, and since then, no one had dared to make a sound. He came down the stairs to meet her, not in a hurry, but with a deliberate slowness that spoke of deep weariness. Ethan Blackwood was more impressive in person than he had been in the pictures in the financial magazines. Tall, with a bone structure that the camera loved, he moved with the restrained grace of a predator. Up close, though, Lucy saw the cracks in his facade. There was a set in his jaw, a pallor beneath his tan, and most telling of all, a hollowness in his blue eyes. They were the eyes of a man who saw the world through thick glass, present in body but absent in spirit. He stood at a formal distance from her, his hands in the pockets of his perfectly tailored trousers. "Miss Evans," he said, and his voice was a low baritone, a little rough with disuse. "I appreciate you coming." It wasn't a greeting, it was a transaction. He was hiring her to solve a problem he couldn't solve himself, and the distance in his tone made that painfully clear. Before the children could be summoned, Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, materialized at Ethan's side. She was the epitome of rigidity, a thin woman with her hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful. Her black dress was immaculate, her gaze sharp. She had served the Blackwood family for 30 years and saw herself not as a servant, but as the guardian of order and the memory of the late Mrs. Blackwood. Her gaze swept Lucy from head to toe, taking in her simple clothes, her practical shoes, her open expression. It was a look of instant disdain. To Mrs. Gable, Lucy was a foreign body, an outside influence, and quite possibly another failure in the long line of nannies who had tried and failed to penetrate the fortress of mourning in that house. She said not a word, but her silent, disapproving presence was a message in itself. Then Ethan called out to them, "Samuel, Sophia, please come down." His voice echoed in the silent house. They appeared at the top of the stairs, two small figures identical in their isolation. They did not run down. They descended one step at a time, hand in hand, their movements in perfect and frightening synchrony. They were dressed in gray woolen clothes, their small faces pale and serious. They reached the foot of the stairs and stopped, looking not at Lucy, but at a spot on the floor a few feet away. They were like porcelain dolls, beautiful and fragile, but without the sparkle of life in their eyes. Lucy felt her heart physically contract. She had expected sad children, perhaps angry or rebellious. She was not prepared for this nothingness, this complete disconnection from the world around her. Lucy's instincts, honed by a lifetime of caring for younger siblings and cousins in a large, chaotic family, took over. Ignoring Ethan's cold presence and Mrs. Gable's judgmental gaze, she moved forward. In one fluid motion, she knelt on the marble floor, the fabric of her jeans making a soft rustle. Lowering herself to their level was an act of submission, a way of saying, "I am not a threat." She didn't want to loom over them like yet another adult authority figure telling them what to do. She wanted to meet them where they were, on the ground, at the level of their pain. She felt the cold of the stones seep into her knees, a small dose of the chill that seemed to emanate from those two little souls. She stood there silent for a moment, just breathing, letting them adjust to her closer presence. "Hello," she said finally, her voice a whisper so as not to break the fragile stillness. "My name is Lucy." She looked at the boy, Samuel, then at the girl, Sophia. She said their names as if they mattered, as if they were more than just labels. She didn't smile broadly. She offered only a small, gentle lift of the corners of her mouth, a gesture that invited rather than demanded. Then she took something out of her coat pocket. It was a small, smooth stone, pale gray, that she had found in a creek near her home in Iowa. It was shaped like an imperfect heart. She didn't offer it. She just placed it on the marble floor between her and them. "I like to collect stones," she said softly. "This one reminded me of a heart." The stone sat there, a small dot of organic simplicity in the vast, polished expanse, a silent offering. The children did not move. Their eyes remained fixed on the floor. But Lucy, watching closely, saw the tiniest of reactions. Samuel's head tilted a fraction of a millimeter to the right, his peripheral eyes registering the object on the floor. Sophia's fingers, which were intertwined with her brother's, twitched slightly. They were tiny reactions, spasms of interest in a nervous system that had shut down. To Lucy, they were signs of life, like the faint beep of a heart monitor. She knew, in that instant, that the door was not completely closed. It was just locked from the inside. She would not try to force it open. She would just sit outside patiently and slip little messages of hope under it, hoping that eventually someone on the other side would decide to turn the key. Ethan, who had been watching the scene with a mixture of skepticism and a hopelessness he barely allowed himself to feel, felt the need to intervene, to break the intensity of the silent moment. "Let me show you the rest of the house, Miss Evans," he said, his voice loud and intrusive. The tour was quick and impersonal. He pointed to the rooms as if he were describing the layout of an office. The library, the music room, the sunroom. Each room was a variation on the same theme: pristine perfection and lifelessness. The playroom, with its expensive toys still in their boxes, was perhaps the saddest of all. It was a space built for joy, but it contained only the echo of silence, a stark reminder that the tools of happiness mean nothing without the will to be happy. On the walls, photographs of Eleonora Blackwood were a constant presence. She was everywhere, her vibrant smile a painful contrast to the somber atmosphere of the house. There was a large photo of her in the living room, laughing, her arms around a visibly younger and happier Ethan. Her eyes in the photo shone with an intelligence and warmth that made Lucy's heart ache for a man she barely knew, and a woman she would never know. Lucy understood that the challenge here was not just grieving for her children and her husband. It was also competing with a ghost of a perfection, of a happiness that seemed impossible to match. How could one bring life back to a place that was so devoted to preserving the memory of a lost life? The ritual of dinner was the embodiment of the house's problem. Mrs. Gable oversaw the service with military precision. The food, prepared by a chef who came 3 times a week, was technically perfect. Filet of sea bass with a bed of pea puree and thin asparagus. It was served in the vast dining room under the cool light of a crystal chandelier. Ethan sat at the head of the table, his tablet already propped up next to his plate. The children were seated and silence descended on the table. It was a ritualistic silence, heavy with the weight of hundreds of failed dinners before it. The food sat on the plates untouched. Samuel stared at the tablecloth. Sophia stared at her hands in her lap. It was a silent hunger strike, a protest against the very life that was being offered to them. Ethan didn't say a word. He didn't insist, he didn't threaten, he didn't plead. He simply accepted failure as part of the routine. After 10 minutes of silence, he folded his napkin, placed it beside his plate, and stood up. "I have a call," he mumbled, an excuse that everyone in the room knew was a cop-out. He retreated to the safety of his office, leaving Lucy alone at the table with the two small statues and the disapproving housekeeper watching from the doorway. Lucy looked at the perfectly arranged food, at the wealth and care that had gone into this meal, and saw its utter futility. These children didn't need nourishment for their bodies. They needed something to feed their souls, and that wasn't to be found in a fillet of sea bass. It was then that Lucy made her decision. She wasn't here to follow the rules of a broken house. She was here to fix it. With deliberate calm, she began to collect the dishes. Hers, Samuel's, Sophia's, Mrs. Gable stepped forward, a sharp sound of disapproval in her throat. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked, her voice icy. Lucy turned to her, the 3 plates balanced in her arms. "I'm going to make dinner," she replied simply. The audacity of the statement left the housekeeper momentarily speechless. Lucy didn't wait for an argument. She marched into the kitchen, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with newfound purpose. She was going to break every rule in this house to save these children. The kitchen was a professional space of stainless steel and quartz surfaces, but for Lucy, it was a sanctuary. She ignored the fancy appliances and went straight to the pantry. She searched for the simplest ingredients, the building blocks of comfort: flour, eggs, sugar, butter, and hidden on an upper shelf, a large bag of chocolate chips. As Mrs. Gable watched from the doorway, her arms crossed in a knot of indignation, Lucy got to work. Her movements were sure and efficient, born of years of helping her mother and grandmother. She didn't measure precisely. She felt the dough, the sound of the wooden spoon hitting the bowl, the cloud of flour rising into the air, the scent of vanilla. These were the sounds and smells of a real home, not a showroom. The aroma that began to waft from the oven was a weapon of mass seduction. The warm, sweet, rich smell of chocolate chip cookies baking was a fundamental contradiction to the atmosphere of the house. It was a smell of riotous joy, of simple comfort, of childlike indulgence. It traveled down the hallways, up the grand staircase, under the door of Ethan's office and into the children's bedrooms. It was an irresistible invitation, a promise that something good and warm was happening somewhere in this cold house. It was the smell of hope itself, and it was strong enough to lure even the most reclusive souls out of their hiding places. Like moths to a flame, they came. First Sophia, then Samuel. They stood in the kitchen doorway, their pale faces lit by the warm glow of the oven. They watched as Lucy, wearing oven mitts, took out the baking sheet. The smell became overwhelming. The cookies were imperfect, some a little larger, some slightly burned around the edges. They were real. Lucy said nothing. She transferred them to a wire rack to cool, the clang of the cookies hitting the rack breaking the silence. Then she turned and saw the 2 small figures in the doorway. She didn't smile broadly. She just gave them a small nod, an acknowledgement of their presence, a silent permission for them to stay. She didn't serve them at the dinner table. She cleared a space on the kitchen island. She poured 2 small glasses of milk. When the cookies were warm to the touch but not hot enough to burn, she placed several on a plate and set it in the center of the island. And then she did the most important thing of all. She turned and began washing the dishes, her back to them. It was an act of profound trust. She wasn't watching them, she wasn't pressuring them with her expectations. She was giving them the privacy to make their own decisions, the autonomy to choose whether or not they wanted to participate in this moment of comfort. The sound of running water was the only thing that filled the silence. She heard the sound before she saw it, the soft crunch of a cookie being picked up from the plate. She continued to wash, her heart pounding. Then came the sound of a small bite, the crunch of the cookie breaking. She dared to look over her shoulder. Samuel was eating. His eyes were closed and he chewed slowly, as if he were studying a long-forgotten flavor. Sophia watched him. Seeing that nothing terrible had happened, that her brother was safe, she took one too. She took a bite, and the chocolate smear that appeared at the corner of his mouth was the first imperfection, the first mark of life that Lucy saw on his face. They ate, standing in silence in the kitchen. But they ate. Ethan could smell the scent of his second-floor fortress. It was so incongruous, so defiantly domestic that it drew him out of his self-imposed exile. He crept down the stairs and stood in the shadows of the hallway, surveying the scene in the kitchen. He saw his children, eating, willingly, and it wasn't an expensive dish or a balanced meal. It was chocolate chip cookies, the simplest and most powerful antidote to grief he'd ever witnessed. He looked at Lucy, her back to the children, giving them space, and felt a surge of something he couldn't name. It was more than gratitude. It was admiration. A deep admiration for the instinctive wisdom of this woman, who had understood that the key to her children lay not in their minds but in their hearts and in their stomachs. That night, the bedtime routine was different. When Lucy tucked them into their beds, they didn't flinch. Their usually stiff bodies seemed a little more relaxed. As she leaned over to turn out the light, Sophia reached out, and her little finger brushed Lucy's for a second. It was a deliberate touch. A thread of connection, faint but real, had been established. Lucy left the room and closed the door softly, her heart filled with happy exhaustion. She knew the battle was far from over. Mrs. Gable still despised her. Ethan was still an enigma, and the children's pain was an ocean deep. But that night, with the smell of chocolate still in the air, she felt like she had taught this house a new word. The word was maybe. Maybe things could be different. And for now, maybe was enough. As soon as the nursery door closed, leaving Lucy in the silent hallway, the atmosphere in the house seemed to change. The small victory in the kitchen, the smell of chocolate chip cookies, had been an act of silent rebellion against the mansion's regime of mourning, and the rebellion would not go unnoticed. Mrs. Gable was waiting for her at the foot of the stairs, her posture rigid as that of a general whose fort has been infiltrated. Her face, usually a mask of cool neutrality, was now set in an expression of active disapproval. She did not wait for Lucy to come all the way down. "Miss Evans," she began, her voice low but sharp as broken glass, "I would like a word with you in the kitchen." It was not a request. It was a summons. Lucy knew that a confrontation was inevitable. The warmth of the small connection she had felt with the children was quickly replaced by a chill of anticipation. The battle for the soul of this house was about to have its first direct skirmish. In the spotlessly clean kitchen, Mrs. Gable had already wiped away all traces of the happy mess of flour and chocolate. The housekeeper turned to face Lucy. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked, her voice still controlled but vibrating with suppressed fury. "Your job here is to follow a structure, to provide proper care, and to respect the routines established for the well-being of the children. Your job is not to introduce sugar and chaos into their systems, undermining the authority of this household and flouting the nutritional guidelines that the late Mrs. Blackwood so carefully established." The mention of Eleonora was deliberate, a weapon designed to put Lucy in her place, to remind her that she was merely a temporary substitute in a world that did not belong to her, and whose rules she had no right to change. Lucy listened quietly, letting the torrent of accusations wash over her. She didn't flinch or show any anger. When Mrs. Gable finished, Lucy took a deep breath and answered, her voice calm and steady. "With all due respect, Mrs. Gable, the children weren't hungry for food. They were hungry for comfort, hungry for a moment that wasn't burdened with sadness and rules. What happened in this kitchen tonight wasn't about nourishment. It was about connection. It was the first step. They needed to feel that this house could still be a home, a place where the smell of cookies baking was possible, before they could even think about eating a balanced meal." She spoke not with the insolence of a rebellious employee, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood a deeper truth, a truth that couldn't be found in any childcare manual. Lucy's emotional logic didn't penetrate Mrs. Gable's armor. To the governess, the house was run on order, discipline, and the preservation of memories, not sentiment and cookies. "That's cheap sentimentality and insubordination," she snapped, her lips thin with disdain. "Mr. Blackwood will be informed of your actions immediately. He does not tolerate deviations from the routine. I believe your tenure in this house will be much shorter than that of your predecessors." The threat was clear. Mrs. Gable was about to use her seniority and her trust with Ethan to crush this little rebellion before it could take root. Lucy simply nodded, accepting the ultimatum. She had done what she believed was right, and she was prepared to face the consequences. "That won't be necessary, Mrs. Gable." Ethan's voice came from the kitchen doorway, making both women turn with a start. He stood there, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed. No one knew how long he had been listening. His face was grim, but his eyes were focused on Lucy with an intensity she had never seen before. He addressed the housekeeper then, and his voice, though low, carried the unmistakable weight of a final order. Miss Evans acted under my implicit authority. Her methods, though unconventional, have achieved a result that no one else has achieved. From now on, she has complete autonomy in the emotional well-being of the children. Do I make myself clear? The intervention was so direct, so final, that Mrs. Gable's jaw dropped. She had been publicly contradicted, her authority undermined. With a stiff shake of her head and a look of pure resentment at Lucy, she turned and stalked out of the kitchen in furious silence. The housekeeper's departure left a vacuum in the kitchen, which was quickly filled with tension of a different kind. Now it was just Ethan and Lucy, the powerful billionaire and the humble Nanny. But the dynamic between them had fundamentally changed in the last few minutes. He was no longer just her boss. He was her advocate. She was no longer just his employee. She was the only person who had been able to reach her children. A silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence of reassessment as they both processed the new landscape of their relationship. Lucy felt exposed, as if he had seen not only her actions but also the philosophy behind them. Ethan, for his part, felt as if a window had been opened in a room that had been closed for years, letting in a new, unfamiliar air. It was he who broke the silence. "Thank you," he said, the words sounding inadequate for the enormity of what he felt. He walked into the kitchen, stopping on the other side of the quartz island. I heard what you said to Mrs. Gable, about their emotional starvation." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and exhaustion. "I've hired the best specialists, the best nutritionists, the best psychologists. They've all come up with plans and strategies. No one's ever mentioned cookies." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his facade of control. She saw a lost and desperate father. "How did you know?" he asked, the question genuine, stripped of any pride. "How did you know what to do?" Lucy leaned against the counter, feeling the weariness of the day in her bones. She thought of her own childhood, of her house full of people and noise and love. She thought of her mother, who had always said that an empty belly hears no advice and a sad heart tastes no flavor. "I didn't know," she answered honestly. "I just felt it. Where I come from, we don't separate food from feeling. Food is the first way we say I care. It's the simplest way to offer comfort. When a child is sick or sad, we don't offer a plan of action. We offer hot soup, a piece of cake. I just did what my grandmother would have done. I tried to offer a little warmth in the midst of so much cold." Her explanation was so simple, so devoid of psychological jargon, that its wisdom seemed all the more profound. Ethan watched her as she spoke, and he saw much more than just a nanny. He was used to a world of analytical intelligence, complex strategies, and data-driven solutions. Lucy's wisdom was of a different kind. It was ancient, instinctive, emotional. It was a kind of intelligence that money couldn't buy and degrees couldn't confer. He felt a pang of admiration that surprised him. In his world of industrial titans and tech geniuses, he was rarely impressed. But this young woman, with her simple logic and compassionate heart, had made a deep impression on him. He realized that to fix his family, maybe he didn't need another expert. Maybe he needed a human being. "What do you see when you look at them?" he asked, his voice lower, more vulnerable. "Be honest." The question was an invitation into her innermost circle of concern. Lucy chose her words carefully. "I don't see broken children," she said. "I see children who are being incredibly loyal. Loyal to their mother, loyal to their pain. They are in a world that stopped the day she left. And this house helps keep that world frozen. Everything is perfect. Everything is silent. It's a museum to the life that was before, and they are acting as the guardians of that museum. In order for them to live again, someone has to give them permission. Someone has to show them that it's okay to make new memories, to feel joy again, that it's not a betrayal." Her honesty hit him hard because he knew it was true. He was the head curator of this museum. He had insisted that nothing in Eleonora's room be touched. He had maintained the routines, the order, the silence, because he thought he was honoring her memory. But now, through Lucy's eyes, he saw that perhaps he was only embalming the pain, trapping his own children in it. He looked around the spotless kitchen, at the shiny surfaces and sterile order, and for the first time, he hated it. He felt a sudden urge to mess it up, to leave fingerprints on the cabinets, to spill flour on the floor, anything to prove that this place was still alive. "Eleonora loved this kitchen," he said suddenly. his voice a little choked. She didn't cook much in the end, but she loved making birthday cakes. For the kids' birthdays, she'd spend all night in here, covered in flour, making elaborate cakes shaped like castles and spaceships. It was the first time he'd shared a specific happy memory of his wife with Lucy. It was a small gift of trust, an invitation for her to see the woman behind the ghost. He was subconsciously beginning to follow her advice. He was giving himself permission to remember the joy, not just the tragedy. Lucy listened, her face soft and attentive. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," or, "That must be hard." She knew cheap sympathy was useless for pain this big. Instead, she asked a simple question. What were the cakes like? The question surprised him. He'd expected a cliché of comfort, not a request for details. And then he began to describe them. The castle cake that had towers of ice cream cones, the spaceship cake that had silver candy like stars. And as he spoke, a faint smile touched his lips for the first time that night. He wasn't talking about his dead wife. He was talking about the cake artist, the fun-loving mother. And Lucy just listened, her silence creating a safe space for those memories to come up and breathe. The intimacy of that moment in the quiet kitchen was deeper than any conversation he'd had in years. He was sharing parts of himself he'd kept locked away, and she was receiving them with a quiet grace and understanding that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't in a long time. He became acutely aware of her presence, the soft scent of vanilla that still lingered about her, the way the kitchen light caught in her hair, the calm in her eyes. He felt an urge, a need to close the distance between them, to cross the quartz island that separated them. It was an urge that made no sense, that was wholly inappropriate, but it was undeniable. He stood where he was, fighting the urge. The lines between employer and employee, between grieving father and caregiver, had been irrevocably blurred that night. He had hired her to care for his children, but she was somehow caring for him too. The kitchen, which had been the scene of a confrontation and a victory, was now the scene of a new and dangerous possibility. The connection that was forming between them was a new element in the already complex equation of this house. It was a complication he must avoid at all costs, but in his weary heart, it also felt like the one thing that might ultimately save them all. "It's late," Lucy said, finally breaking the spell. "I should check on the kids before I go to bed myself." It was a way of re-establishing professional boundaries, of retreating into the safety of her role. "I'll go with you," Ethan said, the decision made in an instant. Normally, the nightly check-in was strictly the nanny's job. Her offer to accompany her was another small but significant breach of protocol. He no longer wanted to be a bystander. He wanted to participate, even in the simplest tasks of his children's lives. He wanted to learn from her, to watch how she interacted with them in that quiet space between wakefulness and sleep. They walked up the grand staircase together, their footsteps echoing in unison. In the nursery, the only light came from a small moon-shaped lamp. Samuel and Sophia lay in their beds, apparently asleep. The atmosphere in the room was noticeably lighter than when Lucy had first seen them. The stiffness in their sleeping bodies had eased. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching as Lucy moved around the room with quiet grace. She adjusted Samuel's blanket, which had slipped off. She picked up a book that had fallen to the floor beside Sophia's bed and placed it on the bedside table. These were small, motherly gestures, filled with a care that went beyond any job description. Ethan felt like an intruder on his own territory. He, who was supposed to be the provider of comfort, didn't know how to navigate this sacred space. Spurred on by a new impulse, he approached Samuel's bed and awkwardly reached out to brush a strand of hair from his son's forehead. The boy's skin was warm beneath his fingers. He hadn't done this in months, maybe a year. The simple act of touching his sleeping son sent a wave of love and regret through him. He looked at Sophia's bed and felt the same longing to connect. He was relearning the language of fatherly touch, a language he had forgotten in the midst of his grief. Just as Lucy was about to leave the room, a small, sleepy voice cut through the silence. "Thank you," Sophia whispered from her bed, her eyes still closed. The word was barely audible, a wisp of sound in the dark room. But to Lucy and Ethan, it sounded like an explosion. It was the first word the girl had ever spoken directly to Lucy. A word of gratitude, acknowledgement, acceptance. Lucy froze, her heart pounding. She looked at the small form on the bed and then at Ethan, whose eyes were wide with astonishment. Sophia's small wall of silence had been broken, not by a demand, but in response to a simple act of kindness. They left the room together, closing the door behind them with infinite care so as not to disturb the fragile moment. In the dimly lit hallway, they stared at each other. The enormity of what had happened that night loomed between them. It had begun with the children's refusal to eat and was ending with a word of thanks. A small bridge had been built over a chasm of pain. Ethan looked at Lucy, at the weariness in her shoulders and the strength in her eyes, and felt a surge of gratitude so deep it left him speechless. He could only echo his daughter's words. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking, "for everything." And in that shared thanks, a new promise was born. A fragile but stubborn promise that maybe, just maybe, the sun would shine again in that dark house. Ethan's thanks rang out in the dimly lit hallway, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of pain and silence. In that moment, they were no longer boss and employee, but two survivors of an emotional shipwreck, staring at each other on the shore of a new, unfamiliar island. His power and wealth were irrelevant. Her humble origins were too. What mattered was the shared humanity they had found in that brief moment. Lucy saw in him not a tech mogul, but a father struggling to reconnect. He saw in her not a nanny, but a force of nature, a quiet wisdom that had triumphed where logic and money had failed. They stood there in the quiet upstairs, while the great house below continued its restless slumber, both aware that the dynamic between them had been permanently altered by the simple offer of a cookie and a single word of gratitude. They descended the grand staircase in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence Lucy had encountered when she arrived. It was a contemplative silence, filled with the echoes of the night's events. Each step they descended seemed to take them further away from the stagnant mourning of the past and closer to an uncertain but living present. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum to Lucy. She could now see the empty spaces not as absence but as possibility. The vast foyer could be filled with the sound of children running. The formal living room could be home to blanket forts. The journey would be long, she knew, but for the first time, she could envision a future for this house that was not simply a repetition of its painful past. When they reached the foyer, the usual routine would have dictated that he retire to his office and she to her bedroom, but that routine had been broken. They paused, hesitant in the center of the vast marble floor. "Would you care for some tea?" Ethan asked, the question awkward but sincere. It was a gesture of hospitality, an attempt to prolong the moment, to keep the connection they'd forged from dissipating into the formality of the evening. He didn't want to go back to being the reclusive boss. He wanted, even if only for a few more minutes, to remain the man who'd shared a moment of vulnerability with her. It was an invitation to redefine the terms of their relationship beyond the confines of an employment contract. "I'd love to," Lucy replied, and they moved into the vast living room. The room, which had once seemed like a pristine magazine set, now felt simply large and lonely. Instead of sitting on opposite ends of the massive sofas, as the layout suggested, they chose two armchairs that sat closer together, near the unlit marble fireplace. They had created their own island of intimacy in the midst of this ocean of formality. As Ethan went to make tea, Lucy allowed herself to look at the space with new eyes. She no longer saw just the wealth, but the loneliness that came with it. This was the cocoon of a man who had shielded himself from the world, and she had somehow found a chink in his armor. When he returned with 2 cups of steaming tea, the conversation that followed was not about big issues. They did not talk about grief, or the future, or Mrs. Gable. Instead, they talked about the children. Ethan listened with rapt attention as she described the little things she had noticed that single evening. The way Sophia arranged her pencils by color before drawing. The way Samuel tapped his foot rhythmically when he was nervous. These were details that a father present would have noticed, and Ethan realized with a pang of pain how much of a stranger he had become to his own children. He was seeing them through Lucy's eyes, and this new perspective was both painful and deeply revealing. Ethan's gaze drifted to the large oil portrait of Eleonora that hung over the fireplace. Her painted smile seemed to survey the scene with quiet benevolence. Before looking at that portrait had been torture for him, a constant reminder of his loss. But that night, after witnessing the small resurrection of joy in his children, he looked at his dead wife's face and felt something different. It wasn't just grief. It was a tender gratitude for the life they had shared. He felt the need to share a piece of it with Lucy, to show her the woman behind the painting. "She would have liked you," he said, his voice low. "Eleonora." She had a gentle soul like yours, but she got a little lost in this world of appearances. She always said that Sophia had the soul of a poet," he continued, a wistful smile touching his lips, "and that Samuel had the heart of an engineer, always trying to figure out how things worked, even if it meant taking them apart." He was talking about her in the present tense, almost as if she were in the room with them. He was sharing the little anecdotes, the loving observations that form the essence of a shared life. In doing so, he was turning Eleonora's ghost into a memory. He was showing Lucy that the woman he had lost was not some unattainable ideal of perfection, but a real human being with quirks and dreams and a deep love for her children. Lucy listened, her heart swelling with empathy. She understood the gift he was giving her. He wasn't comparing her to his late wife. He was entrusting her with his memories. "She seems like a wonderful mother," Lucy said softly. "The children have her in their eyes." Her answer was perfect in its simplicity. She didn't try to comfort him, nor was she intimidated by Eleonora's memory. She honored her. She acknowledged the love that still existed and, in doing so, created a space where a new kind of feeling could perhaps begin to grow without feeling like a betrayal. She showed him that it was possible to hold the door to the past open with love, without it preventing a new door to the future from opening. Their conversation was a delicate dance between past and present. He talked about how the empire he had built had isolated him, about how, after Eleonora's death, he had buried himself in his work because numbers were easier to understand than feelings. She in turn talked about her small town in Iowa, about the simplicity of a life where success was measured by the quality of one's crops and the strength of one's community ties. They came from different worlds, but that night, in the quiet of that room, they discovered that they spoke the same universal language, that of loneliness, loss, and the search for connection. With each story shared, the chasm between the billionaire and the nanny narrowed, revealing just a man and a woman. A deep exhaustion, more emotional than physical, finally began to set in. The evening had been a roller coaster of confrontations, revelations, and fragile breakthroughs. The adrenaline that had sustained them began to fade, leaving behind a calm weariness. They finished their tea in comfortable silence. The attraction that had flared between them in the kitchen was still there, a silent electric current in the air, but they both knew instinctively that tonight was not about that. There was a foundation to be built, a trust to be solidified. Whatever might be between them would have to wait. The priority was the fragile peace they had gained for the children, and neither of them was willing to risk it on an impulse. "It's too late," Ethan said finally, his voice reluctant. "You've had an extraordinary first day. You need to rest." He stood and she followed. He walked her through the great hall and down the hallway to the guest room that had been assigned to her. The walk was formal, but the atmosphere between them had changed forever. He was no longer just the man who signed her check. He was someone who had shared her grief with her. She was no longer just the woman hired to care for his children. She was the person who had shown him a glimmer of hope. They were accomplices now, partners in a mission of healing. At the door to her room, he paused. The formality of the situation seemed inappropriate, but neither of them knew how to break it. "Lucy," he said, and the way he said her name was different now, softer, more personal. "I don't know how to thank you. What you did tonight, with the cookies, with your patience, it was more than any expert could do in a year. You gave them a moment of childhood, and you gave me a moment of hope." Their eyes met, and his gratitude was so palpable that Lucy felt her face flush. He was giving her credit for opening the first window in that dark house. "I just did what I thought was right," she said, her voice shaking a little. "They're wonderful children, Ethan. They're just lost." The use of his first name was natural, a reflection of the intimacy they had established. It was a small slip of formality that meant everything. It confirmed that they had crossed a threshold. She was no longer talking to Mr. Blackwood and the tycoon. She was talking to Ethan, the father, the man, and he was not talking to Miss Evans, the nanny. He was talking to Lucy, the woman who had shown him a way forward. He wanted to say more. He wanted to express the admiration he felt, the attraction that confused him, the hope she had ignited, but the words seemed too big and too clumsy. Instead, he offered the only thing that seemed appropriate, a smile. Not the polite, empty smile he wore for the cameras, but a small, genuine, slightly sad smile that finally reached his tired eyes. In that smile was a vocabulary of gratitude, respect, and a silent promise that things would be different starting tomorrow. "Good night, Lucy," he said softly. "Good night, Ethan," she replied, and walked into her room, closing the door behind her. She leaned against the cool wood, alone at last, and let out a shaky breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. The closed door felt like a barrier against the intensity of the night. She felt as if she'd run an emotional marathon. Every fiber of her being was exhausted, but her heart felt strangely light. She had come to this house expecting a difficult task, but she was unprepared for the depth of the challenge or the intensity of her own response to it. The night was over, but she felt with every part of her being that her true journey was just beginning. Alone in the quiet of her luxurious but impersonal guest room, Lucy allowed the events of the evening to wash over her. The sight of the children's blank faces, Mrs. Gable's stiffness, the pain in Ethan's eyes, and then the small victories, the touch of a finger, the bite of a cookie, the whispered word, "Thank you." It seemed like a lifetime had passed in the few hours since she had arrived. She walked to the window and looked out over the dark grounds of the mansion. The house looked like a ship asleep in a sea of darkness, its interior lights like distant stars. She felt the weight of the responsibility she had taken on, a responsibility that went far beyond making sure the children were safe and fed. She opened her small canvas suitcase on the large, soft bed. Her simple clothes, her few paperbacks, and the framed photo of her parents seemed like objects from another planet in this room of restrained wealth. The contrast between her world and this one was stark, and yet she had found a way to connect. Not through money or status, but through the universal language of kindness. What this house needed was not more perfection or more expensive things. It needed humanity. It needed the smell of cookies baking. It needed permission to be imperfect, to be messy, to be sad, and eventually to be happy again. She thought of Samuel and Sophia. The image of their faces as they tasted the chocolate was etched in her mind. It was a moment of pure, simple sensory pleasure, a break through her haze of grief, and Sophia's "thank you." It was such a fragile sound, yet so powerful. In that moment, her heart filled with a fierce, protective love for these two children she barely knew. It wasn't pity. It was a deep sense of purpose. She wasn't just doing a job anymore. She was on a mission. She would stay in that house and fight for them, fight for their right to a childhood, no matter how strict the housekeeper was or how lost their father was. And then she thought of Ethan, of the man behind the billionaire. She saw his pain, his loneliness, his struggle to be the father his children needed when he himself was barely keeping afloat. She felt the pull between them, the spark of connection in the kitchen, but with the clarity that exhaustion brings, she pushed it aside. That feeling, whatever it was a complication they couldn't afford right now. It was too dangerous. The focus had to be on the children. Their healing was the priority. Anything else was a luxury that would have to wait. She needed to be their rock, their steadying presence in their chaotic world, and that required clear boundaries, even as her own heart protested. Lucy finally lay down on the bed, the mattress so soft it felt like it was floating. The house was silent once more, but for the first time since she had arrived, the silence did not feel threatening. It was filled with the resonance of the night's events. It was an expectant silence. The crucial night was over. A small seed of hope had been planted in the barren soil of this family. Lucy did not know if it would sprout. She knew only that the mountain of grief was still immense and that the journey would be long and difficult. But as she closed her eyes, the last image in her mind was of a chocolate stain on the corner of a little girl's mouth and the sound of a single word, "Thank you." And she knew, with a certainty that soothed her soul, that she would do it all over again tomorrow. Lucy didn't seek the fortune of an empire. She just wanted to offer the warmth of a homemade cookie. In the process, she ended up giving life back its flavor, childhood to two children, and hope to a father who had forgotten how to feel. Sometimes grief turns us into curators of a private museum, where we polish memories but let life gather dust. We believe that order and silence honor the departed, but we forget that the greatest tribute we can pay to a life full of love is to allow a new life to flourish, even if it is messy and imperfect. It is in this emptiness that we discover the power of a simple gesture, the courage to break the rules of stagnant mourning, and the truth that a family is not rebuilt with big plans, but with the patience of waiting for someone to take the first bite of a cookie. If this story touched your heart just like it did for Lucy, Ethan, Samuel, and Sophia, Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other journeys that remind us of what really matters, feeding the heart first.